Hello dear chess friends, today I will look at knight and bishop checkmate. This is probably the most debated endgame of all, and there are quite a few misconceptions which I must clear up. Firstly, it's said to be extremely difficult, but in fact I'd say that anybody can learn it, and even without this prior knowledge, which I'm going to give you in this lecture, I think a 2000 ELO rated player could just sit at the board, face this position and solve the problems. But I'm going to make the job a lot easier for you by showing you some key positions, some key maneuvers, and really at the end of it you can just enjoy this endgame because it does teach us a few fundamentals about how the pieces work together. And let's get on with it. So this is the really key position, because if you remember this, you'll remember some key rules. Let's see. Bishop g7 check, king h7, knight f6 checkmate. And now we see, if you remember this position, you'll realize in your own games, if you meet this over the board, that the king must be forced into the corner that is the square of the same color as that of the square that your bishop is positioned on. This means if you have a dark square bishop, you see these dark squares. If you have a light square bishop, then king must be forced to the light squares. But let's say there are two stages to this process of mating the black king. First, if the king's in the center, we must drive it to the edge, and usually we see that a good defender, if he knows this or has some ideas, or can just use logic at the time, will try to reach the opposite color square, so that square on which your bishop is positioned. So really we need to drive it then to h8. And okay, really at the board there might be one or two weird concepts, and these are some tricky maneuvers which really we have to learn in this lecture. Okay, so we've seen number one, checkmate, and now here is number two. So this is a mate in 3, knight g6 check, king h7, knight f8 check, king h8, and bishop f6 checkmate. And this shows that the bishop is most important on this long diagonal when we trap the king in the corner. So by all means don't forget to pause the video, you can review it and rewind at any point, just so you make sure that these moves are surely, concretely stored in your memory. Number 3, this is a mate in 4. Again we see the theme that the king must be driven here. At the moment this square is controlled and the king controls this, these squares. So after knight f5, king h8 is forced, and now we don't play knight h6. Don't forget that we do have to watch out for stalemates, because when we're dealing with the king in the corner and you have very little time, just make sure that you don't give stalemate. Bishop e7. This is a good move, and the point is that now after king g8 we play check and checkmate. Here's another example, another mate in 4. At the moment we control these squares, but we don't want the king escaping. Knight d7. And now what happens if black tries to escape? Well, then we bring in our king, these squares controlled, and very simply bishop g7 check, and we do all with checks and then checkmate. Just going back, then we need to look at king h8, king f7. You must always bring in the king, because it provides this brick wall. Check and checkmate. This is yet another checkmating key position. Check, check, and checkmate. Now this is something called the lock. So again, black perhaps has been drawn out of this square, which is good for him, and now it's just a case of bringing him to this dark square. So how to do it? Well, you'll note that this bishop controls this crucial square. I'll flash that. That's a big warning sign in your head, and you realise that this is the way of stopping the king from running in that direction. And while these squares controlled, we see that the knight and bishop complement each other. You see. Okay. Bishop on a dark square controls the dark squares, and this knight on a dark square also complements it brilliantly by controlling the light squares. And we'll see this theme crop up. We bring in the king. And again, okay, so I'll do this. The bishop controls green squares and the knight controls light squares. It's very beautiful how they work together so harmoniously. And now here comes the final blow. In with the king, check, and checkmate. What's this? Transition to the lock. Well, this is how we reach that original position. And this is really where a tricky concept crops up. We have to play quite a, how should we say, illogical move. Or maybe counterintuitive. Okay. Because when the king starts to escape, we need to control these squares. And sometimes we can reach this position with a weird maneuver, which allows the king to come out quite far, but then our bishop and knight duo trap it. And now we just transpose to this original line. Don't be worried, there is a prison, and although this might look a bit fragile, even when you're blitzing, I hope that you'll realise how nicely the king is trapped. Okay, now we're getting a bit more complicated, because this isn't when the king's in the corner, this is the process of driving it to the corner. King d6, king f7, knight e7. Okay, note that we need to advance and push it back because of the Zugzwang rule, yes. And also don't forget that it doesn't matter what the defender does, this is forced ultimately. Although he can walk into a few checkmates, ultimately you can do it. Okay, now this is the counterintuitive move I was talking about really, because you've allowed the king to come out, and now seemingly there's a route away and to this ideal square, but not so fast. Here, brilliant light squares and the dark square, and this is a really nice trap. Again, no way out, and then this is a simpler way to play it. Okay, we bring in the king. And again, and it's the same old story. Checkmate. Our last example, the drive, and this is the whole process. Can you combine everything we've learnt to bring it all the way? Not just from the center, but from the ideal corner from the defender's perspective. Now we use something. It's called the W maneuver. This is nice, you see, controlled, so it's forced out. Now we bring the knight back, and note that the knight will go like this. It's a W, you could say. Oh, excuse me, more like this in fact. Okay, and this is how we do it, because when the knight's here it controls some crucial light squares. Okay, don't worry, we know how to trap it. Brilliant, this is the move. Okay, it might look as though the king is wandering away, but so long as we control these squares, then when the bishop comes here, there is a trap. Brilliant, and we return to the other key position I showed you before. And it's as simple as that. Very simple chess. You know, I could do this blindfolded. Anyone can do this. Very easy. Thank you much. PeterLalic signing off, saying good luck with the chess, and I hope you can checkmate the knight and bishop.